Thanks, guys. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? Now, as soon as I said that, you know immediately where that comes from. It's Walt Disney's 1937 film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, everybody's probably seen that. Even if you haven't seen it, everybody knows the basic storyline. Snow White is this charming and beautiful princess who sort of charmed everybody in the kingdom except for her evil stepmother, the queen. And for decades, the queen has been the fairest or the prettiest person in the kingdom. But as soon as Snow White came around, it became apparent that one day soon, her beauty would eclipse that of the queen's. And so in order to try and hold her down, the queen treats her as basically a live-in maid. So while Snow White is busy scrubbing the floors and cleaning the walls and taking out the garbage, every day the queen, her stepmother, parks herself in front of this magic mirror and she asks the same question, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? And every day, in good King James English, the mirror answers, thou, O queen, art the fairest in the land. That is until one day when the mirror gives the queen an answer that she didn't want to hear. Because instead of identifying her as the fairest one in the land, the mirror begins talking about someone whose beauty has surpassed that of the queen's. And when the queen presses the mirror for an answer, the mirror comes out with it, Snow White, O queen, is the fairest of them all. And it's at that point that the queen realizes that the day that she's been dreading has finally arrived. If you know the story, she gets her huntsman together, sends him out to eliminate Snow White. She wants to eliminate the competition. He tries but backs down. Snow White escapes into the forest where she's then protected by 7 dwarfs. Now fast forward to the end, the queen tricks her. She takes a bite of this poison apple. She falls asleep. Then the prince shows up, kisses her, and she resuscitates, and they live happily ever after. So in that sense, it's kind of like the first Hallmark movie. I mean, it's the same story, just gets repeated over and over again. Everybody knows the story. The original version was published in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm, and since then it's been reimagined and re-released every few years. But what most people don't know is that in recent years, historians have concluded that the story of Snow White is at least loosely based on a true story. The story of a woman named Maria Sophia von Erthel. She was born in 1729. She was the sister of a powerful German archbishop. And in 1743, her mother died. Her father quickly remarried not a queen, but an imperial countess. And shortly after the wedding, the story goes that her father gave her new stepmother a gift, the gift of a mirror. And here's a picture of the actual mirror. What made this mirror so special is that, especially for that time period, is it had a very flat and smooth surface, which meant when you looked in this mirror, the reflection you saw was a truer image than what most people were used to because the other mirrors were not as well made. Because of that, historians call this the mirror that always spoke the truth. And today, it hangs in a museum in southern Germany near where all of this took place. And the way the story goes, it was this mirror that prompted this rivalry between this stepmother and her stepdaughter for the affection of the father. And it went on like this for decades. Now, the dwarfs come into the story, and that the area this took place is a mining town, and so only men under a certain height could work there because of the narrowness of the mines. Now, how much of that is true, I don't know. We'll let the historians figure that out. But here's what I do know is true. All of us, at some point or another, have played our own version of that same game. All of us at some point or another have stood in front of a mirror, and we may have not asked the question, who's the fairest one of all, but we've asked our own questions. We've all got them. Maybe you've never written them down, but they come to you just as naturally as breathing. Who's the richest of them all? Who's the best looking of them all? Who's the most successful of them all? Who's the one that commands the most attention when they walk in a room? Who's the most in shape? Whose kids are doing the best in school? Who lives in the nicest house? Who drives the newest car? I mean, some of us are so competitive by nature that it's almost as if we can't help but every once in a while look up and take a glance at this imaginary scoreboard that we all have just to see how we're doing. And sometimes that's healthy. Sometimes it prompts you to do better. But other times it can become this debilitating weight that feels like it's pulling you under. As Anita said, we're in week 3 of this series where we've been talking about the way we feel about ourselves whenever we see ourselves. And if you have your Bible or your phone with you, I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. This morning we're going to talk about how to break free from a prison that you found yourself in and that I sometimes find myself in, and that's the prison of comparison. And to help us do that, we're going to look at part of a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. Now, just to put this in perspective, years earlier, Paul had been in Corinth. He'd helped to start this church. The implication is he'd probably personally led many of these people to Christ. He'd personally trained their leaders. But then he moved on to some other places to do other things. And in his absence, there are these false teachers who have shown up who are trying to seize control of the church. They're trying to take control, to take the allegiance of the people away from Paul and to them so that they can enrich themselves. And in order to do that, they know they have to discredit Paul. So they start throwing all sorts of false accusations at him, hoping that something will land. And so to defend himself, Paul composes this letter that we call 2 Corinthians. You get to chapter 10, there is a shift in tone. All of a sudden, the intensity level of what he's writing goes up several degrees, and it reads as almost some of the things that he's been careful to hold inside are now spilling over to the outside. And one of the accusations that they've thrown at Paul is that he's bold while he's away from them, and he's timid when he's around them. In other words, he's bold when he's talking about them, but he's a little bit timid when he's talking to them. Today, we call those keyboard warriors. They're the people that write the mean letters and the tough guy sounding Facebook posts, and then in person, they're just as shy, and they refuse to say anything. So Paul responds to this, and I want you to look at what he says in verse 1 of chapter 10. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you, I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold toward you when away. I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. Then you get down to verse 4, and he mentions something that all of us have experienced. You just might not know what to name it. He calls it a stronghold. Check out verse 4. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. A stronghold is and could be translated as a castle or a fortress or even a prison. And the image that comes to my mind is like this well-fortified army base or maybe a maximum security prison. It's someplace where it's hard for the people on the outside to get in, and it's nearly impossible for the people on the inside to get out. And the thing about strongholds is they can come in a lot of different forms. It could be an addiction, an unhealthy relationship, a negative mindset, some sort of financial problem, a physical illness, a mental health problem. It could be something as simple as you can't pay your bills this month. It could be something as simple as my family's completely dysfunctional and they're driving me crazy. Or it could be something as seemingly harmless as continually falling into the comparison trap. Now, all of us have a tendency to do that. And one of the tactics that these false teachers were using against Paul is that they kept trying to draw him into this game of comparison. In their view, they had some things about them that were more impressive than what they knew about him. So they're trying to get him to play this game. They want to discredit him and prop themselves up in the eyes of the people. And you think about Paul's situation, as much as he had accomplished, it would have been very easy for him to step into that trap. But he refuses to do that. What about you? Have you ever done that? Have you ever fallen into the trap of playing this game? You look at the people around you and you're all the time asking the question, well, how do I measure up to them? Am I as pretty as her? Am I as successful as him? Or my kids, are they doing as well as their kids? Is my house as nice as their house? I mean, we've all played some version of that game. In fact, some of us have played it so much that it's almost like it's part of our DNA. It's our second nature. The question then is, how do you break free from that? Check out what Paul says in verse 5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. How do you break free from the prison of comparison? Well, according to Paul, it's this. You have to change your thinking. That's easy to understand, but sometimes hard to do. You have to change the way you think. Paul said we take captive every thought. Not just some thoughts, not just the occasional thought, but every thought. Because Paul understood if you want to change your life, you have to change the way you think. Your life is nothing more than a reflection of the thoughts you think, and your life is always moving in the direction of your thinking. And somehow, over the course of his life, Paul had learned this secret. He learned that it's possible for people to grow to such a degree that they can literally stay out of these traps and capture their own thoughts. They can capture their own thinking. The way it's written in Greek, the word captive literally means prisoner. So the idea is you take this sword, you take this spear, and it's almost like you're at the point of a spear. You're arresting your own thoughts. You're taking your thoughts prisoner before they take you prisoner. Now let's be honest. Most of us do the opposite. Most of us, instead of controlling our thoughts, we allow our thoughts to control us. And so our lives become a reflection of the way we think. But Paul says you've got to flip that. Rather than allowing your thoughts to control you, you have to learn to control your thoughts. And just think about how much healthier and how much more fun your life would be if we could somehow do this. Just imagine if your first instinct when you heard of something good happening to somebody you know was not to compete with them, but to celebrate with them. Or imagine how different it would be if every time you looked in the mirror, rather than feeling the need to compare yourself to whoever you saw on Instagram, you could just be thankful for the person you saw staring back at you. How about this? If you're a follower of Jesus, how much easier and how much better would your day-to-day life be if instead of obsessing over the question, how do I measure up, you instead ask the question, how can I honor him? You think that would release some of this pressure that so many of us live with? As you keep reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul gives us a strategy for learning to live this out. It's one thing to say change your thinking, but he actually tells us how to do it. There are 3 principles he gives us that if you can apply these and learn to put these together, it will change the way that you think, and it will lead to the freedom that so many of us desperately crave. Here's the first thing he says. If you want to experience this freedom, you have to learn to change your metrics. Now you get to verse 7. I want you to look at what he says. He says, you are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they could consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. So even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters, for some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we're present. I want you to imagine that tomorrow morning, your boss has scheduled a meeting with you. And it's going to be sort of your annual review. Instead of doing it in December, they decided to do it tomorrow. And to be honest, you're not too worried about it because you feel like you've done a pretty good job. You might not be the perfect employee, but you haven't done anything too bad, and you feel like it's going to be a good conversation. So you go in the room fully expecting to hear, good job, thanks for what you're doing, and here's your bonus. But as the door to the office slowly shuts, the meeting takes a turn that you never anticipated. And instead of telling you what a great job you've been doing, your boss pulls out a file that's that thick with all of these specific examples of things that you've messed up and complaints about your job performance. And for the next half hour, they go through and they read each specific example. And then at the end of it, your boss summarizes where you stand. And he says this. He says, in our estimation, you're a poor performer, a poor communicator, nobody likes your personality, and I hate to say this, but you're really unattractive. Now, hopefully that's never happened to you. But my suspicion is you've walked in a room at least once expecting one thing and experienced something else. And that's where Paul was. I mean, these were people that he loved. These are people that he had personally helped lead to Christ. But now, rather than cheering him on, what are they doing? They're tearing him down. They criticize his attitude. They criticize his writing style. They criticize his speaking ability. And they're even critical of his appearance. Now, for Paul, this would have been the kind of criticism that hit pretty close to home. I mean, when you're a preacher and somebody says, hey, nobody likes your personality, you're not a very good speaker, and to be honest, you're not all that attractive. I mean, that's kind of tough to take, especially if it's somebody that you love. And that's where Paul is. Now, if you know his story, you know that some of this is ridiculous. I mean, Paul was a brilliant thinker. He was a brilliant writer. But some of this is actually a little bit true. By his own admission, Paul was not a great speaker. You go back to Acts, sometimes when Paul's in this duo, he lets the other guy do the talking. He's kind of the brains behind the operation, but he was not always the face. You get to 2 Corinthians 11, verse 6. Paul admits that he was untrained as a speaker. That was not his strong point. The other thing we know about him is that he was not physically an impressive-looking person. I don't know if you do this or not, but a lot of times when I'm like reading the Bible, I will try to visualize it like it's a movie, right? So I'm trying to, put these people together. And if you do that, you might view Paul, you read about him, you think, well, he's just really, serious-looking, scholar, like some college professor. Or maybe you view him as this really impressive leader. If you ever seen Michelangelo's statue of King David, you might just change the face and think, well, that's Paul. Well, I want you to know that was not Paul. There was a book written 200 A.D., about 150 years after Paul's death, that gives a description of what he looked like. I want you to listen to these. Listen to how Paul gets described. It says, a man of little stature, thin-haired upon the head, crooked in the legs, of good state of body, with eyebrows meeting, and with a nose somewhat hooked, full of grace, for sometimes he appeared like a man, and sometimes he had the face of an angel. There was a lady after the first service came up. She said, that sounds just like my late husband. I don't know what she meant by that, but it's not all bad, but most of that's pretty bad. I mean, he's a little guy, he's balding, he's got shaggy eyebrows, form a unibrow, he's got a hook nose, and he's bow-legged. I mean, this is not the guy that you would think, boy, this is the great Apostle Paul. But there's a part of you, and the Sunday school answer is, well, what does it matter what he looked like, because we know, the things he taught and all that. But deep down inside, appearances matter. And it wasn't just in the first century, it's in our century. That's why Paul says you are judging by appearances. You know who else does that? We do that. We live in a world, we've been trained. We judge everybody and everything on its appearance. Most of the time, the criteria that we use to evaluate each other are external things. Things like how you look and what you wear and where you live and what you drive and how much you make and how many achievements you've accomplished. Most of the time, we evaluate ourselves, the same standard. For most people, it's all about what's on the outside, but from God's perspective, it's the internal things that matter. That's why Paul says you have to stop judging by appearances. You have to change your metrics. In the Old Testament, there's a verse where the nation of Israel is getting ready to choose a new leader. And everybody thinks they're going to pick this guy named Eliab because he's tall and dark and handsome, and he's kind of this impressive, physical person that you would choose for a leader. But I want you to look from 1 Samuel 16, what the Lord says. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Let me ask you something. Do you think that's true? Do you think that could still be true? Do you think in 2021 it's possible that the Lord still looks at the condition of a person's heart more than what they look like when they look in the mirror? And if it is true, then why is it that we have such a hard time letting go of some of that? We're always obsessing over the external things and neglecting the internal things. Now here's the second thing. He says if you want to escape this prison, you got to change your metrics, and then you're going to have to learn to stay in your lane. Now, if you're a person who struggles with this, verse 12 is the one that if you ever get a tattoo, right? And I'm not telling you to, but if you ever get a tattoo, get verse 12 just all the way down your arm. Here's what it says. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God himself has assigned to us, a sphere that also includes you. So Paul says, hey, one of the reasons he continually refuses to engage in this comparison game with these false teachers is he knows it would be unwise. It would be foolish. Not only is it a game that he can't win, he knows it would only serve to distract him from what he'd been called to do. He can't afford to waste his time getting caught up in this game of one-upsmanship with people who don't even have his best interest at heart to start with. Now, I mentioned earlier, all of us struggle with this. And this is something that I've struggled with, not all the time, but occasionally, just like you, I fall into this trap. So I was thinking back, if you were here last year, actually you weren't here because nobody was here. It was this Sunday or next, that they shut us down for 12 weeks. So we come in, and you preach to the camera, and the band would be here, and we did the best we could. And if you remember, it wasn't just us. I mean, everybody was shut down. So you go home on Sunday afternoon, and there would be you go through your social media feed, and there's one link after another. Dozens and dozens of church services, and everybody's online. Now, so what I would do, and you don't raise your hand on this, okay? What I would do is I would sit there, and for an hour, maybe 2 hours, I would watch bits and pieces of different church services. So I might watch a couple minutes here and flip over, because some of the people at home are doing that right now. You know what I mean? They're watching a few minutes here, and some of you have done that. Don't raise your hand. So I'd be scrolling through, and I remember I came across this guy, and he was standing in what looked like his garage. You know what I mean? Like paint cans and oil cans in the back, and he's talking to the camera, and he's red-faced, and he's screaming, and you can't hardly understand a word he's saying. And I'd watch that, and I'd think, I'm pretty good. I mean, hey. I may not be great, but at least you understand what I'm saying, And then I'd keep scrolling. I'd click on something else, and then I'd see Kyle Idleman at Southeast Christian. And I'd watch that, and then I'd flip over. There'd be Tim Keller, New York City. And then Bob Russell would be guest speaking somewhere to pop up, and I'd watch that, and I'd say, man, these guys are otherworldly. How can anybody be that good? Always on point. Voice never cracks. Sometimes I sound like a hillbilly. I'd watch them and think, man, these guys are just so good. I'll never be that good. All within an hour. But I'll tell you what I learned about myself. I'm almost ashamed to admit this, but I'll tell you. It wasn't the Kyle Idlemans at Southeast and Tim Keller in New York City that bothered me. You know what bothered me? Is the clips of the guys that I know. The clips of the guys that I went to school with, the clips of the guys who I've known for a long time. And I'd sit there and I'd watch their messages, and I'd be thinking all these crazy thoughts. I'd start to think, I thought I looked tired today. He never looks tired. How can that guy never be? He must not work as hard as I do. And then there'd be somebody else, and then I'd come through, and they'd have some great point, just be profound. I'd think, I know this guy. He's not that smart. There's no way somebody is writing this stuff for him. There's no way he could do that. Or some guy would come off with a joke, and I'd think, that guy is not funny. I used to eat lunch with this guy 3 days a week. I've never heard him tell a joke, and all of a sudden he's Jerry Seinfeld. Or they'd have some, creative illustration. I think, I worked all week, and I couldn't come with anything half that. And by the time it was over, I feel about that big. Now, you can judge me if you want to, but most of us are guilty of the same thing. It's just not the people that you see on TV or read about in a magazine that drive you crazy. It's the people you know. It's the person whose house is always just a little more in order than yours. It's the sister who's just a little bit prettier than you are. The brother that's just a little more athletic. It's the guy you went to high school with who makes just a little bit more money than you do and drives just a little nicer car and lives in a little bigger house. And here's the deal. You can obsess over all that. I mean, you can drive yourself crazy, but none of that helps you achieve what God has called you to. See, me sitting on my couch keeping score of other people's sermons didn't do anything to help me do what God had asked me to do. A better use of my time would have been to focus my energy on what I'm supposed to do. Same thing is true of you. Whenever you're obsessing over what somebody else is doing, you're missing an opportunity to do what God called you to do. Now here's the last thing. If you're going to break free from this prison, you're going to have to learn to trust God's plan. You get to verse 14, and Paul reiterates that he's not going to engage in this debate about who accomplished what and who's achieved more. Then you get to verse 16, and he subtly mentions that he has a goal for the future. Check out the way he words this, verse 14. We are not going too far in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you. For we did get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. Neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our sphere of activity among you will be greatly expanded, so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For we do not want to boast about work already done in somebody else's territory, but let the one who boasts boast in the Lord, for it is not the one who commends himself who's approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Get to verse 16. Paul makes it clear that whatever happens in Corinth, whatever happens in the future, he's not content to just have to spend the rest of his life with this never-ending debate about who gets the credit for what's already happened. Instead, he's focused on the future. He wants to expand the circle to include people who haven't yet been invited into the circle. But you get to verse 18, he makes it clear that he understands that whether or not that ever happens is not entirely up to him, it's up to God. He says it's God's choice. The Lord will commend those who he chooses to commend. And rather than giving into this deeply ingrained desire that all of us have within our DNA to defend ourselves and to prop ourselves up and to try and make ourselves look better, rather than wasting his time arguing about all of those things, Paul focused on the future, and he decided to trust God's plan even when he wasn't sure what God's plan looked like. I have another picture I want to show you. Years ago, I read a story about the famous escape artist, Harry Houdini. And just like the story of Snow White, historians debate and argue over which of the stories that have come out of his life are true and which ones are fiction. When you've got a showman that was as charismatic and dynamic as he was, sometimes it's hard to separate fact from fiction. You go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, he was the world's most famous stuntman, most famous magician, and he made his real name as an escape artist. And all the time he was setting up these elaborate scenarios in which he'd have to escape from some prison cell. They put handcuffs on him and he'd have to get out. One time they put him in a straitjacket in a box and then put him underwater, and he only had a few minutes before the oxygen ran out. Then there was the time he had himself buried alive, and he had to escape the casket and claw his way to the surface just before he ran out of it. He was all the time doing stuff like that. And during the particular tour of Great Britain in 1904, he issued a challenge. He was doing this magic show in all these little towns in and around London, and he put this ad in the newspaper that there was not a police department in England that could keep him in custody. Now, his thinking was, if they arrest me and they put me in jail, I'll escape, and the newspaper will cover that, and more people will come to the show as a way of gaining publicity. And for a while, it worked. So every day, he would line it up. His manager would line it up. The police would come in. They'd put him in handcuffs. They'd take him to the jail. They'd keep the cuffs on him. They'd lock him in the cell. And then as the newspaper reporters watched and as the cameras flashed, he would slip out of the cuffs. He'd remove these hidden lock picks, and he'd pick the lock, and he'd be out. Then they'd put it on the front page of the paper, and more people would come to his magic show. It went on like that for several days. Thousands of people are reading about his exploits. It went on like that until there was one particular day when another local police department went and got him, and they said, we've got a cell that you cannot escape from. Nobody's ever escaped from it. It's escape-proof. And Houdini said, yeah. So they took him in. They put him in the cuffs. They took him to the little jail. They put him in this cell. They closed the door, and very quickly, just like he always did, he got the cuffs off, and then he started removing all these little lock picks from these hidden compartments in his clothes. So he might have a fake pocket here. The bottom of his shoe came off, and there's all these lock picks. So he went to the cell door, and he started to try to turn the tumblers, but he couldn't get them. So he put that pick down, and he took out another one. This went on and on and on and on. He just could not get the tumblers inside the lock to turn over. As the clock kept ticking, he realized that he was going to have to either get this done or give up, because he was going to miss his show for that night. For 2 hours, He tried to pick the lock to this cell. Before finally it came to the moment where a decision had to be made. I'm either going to stay here or I'm going to go and do my magic show. A lot of money up for grabs. So he said, you're going to have to let me out. And for the first time in his life, he gave up in frustration. He told the guard to unlock the door. The guard never moved. Houdini, in frustration, put his head down and he took his right hand and he put it on the cell. And as he leaned just ever so slightly, the door opened. And the trick was that the door had never been locked to start with. Now, whether or not that story's true, I don't know. But I know this. There's a lot of us have spent our lives inside a prison that we created. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about because you feel it every day. It's that constant need to compare yourself to the people around you. It's that constant pressure that you can't seem to escape to measure up to whatever artificial standard is most important on that given day. It's that instant reflex that you have to criticize yourself rather than celebrate every time you look in the mirror. And it's that feeling that no matter what you do, you'll never really measure up and you just can't seem to shake it. You try, but it's always there. For a lot of us, and you don't have to admit this to me, but you know, for a lot of us, this is a stronghold that you're having a hard time escaping. But here's the question. What if the door was never locked to begin with? What if all you really had to do to experience the freedom that you've spent your life dreaming about was to step through a door that was already unlocked? See, so many of us, man, we're wearing ourselves out and we're frustrated and we're tired and we're on the verge of exhaustion trying to open a door that's already been opened. We're trying to earn a gift that's already been given. We're trying to measure up to a standard that's already been met. We're trying to pay a debt that's already been paid. When all you really had to do was look to Him, because He's already unlocked that door. I want you to stand with me. We're going to have just a brief invitation. And if that's your situation, you'd like to pray with somebody, like to talk to somebody, Dave and I will be here. None of us are perfect. As I said, I struggle with it, and we all struggle with this, but we'd love to pray with you, maybe help you navigate some next steps. If you're here and you feel the Holy Spirit prompting you to make a decision to put your faith in Him, to be baptized into Him, to join our church family, we want you to know that we would love to have you.